and welcome to our weekly Read Aloud series. And we are reading Revolutionary Road this period. Last week we ended at chapter 2 with a fight between April and Frank, a whole confrontation that nearly turned violent, but here we are in chapter 3. It was de-escalated by their mutual agreement to go home, and not break each other's head on the side of the road. And so they went home, you know. And Frank had this whole feeling of, oh, let me apologize. That when I say sorry, everything is perfect. Even though the issues that were brought up in their screaming match were deep rooted issues that obviously saying sorry just feels like a band aid, And April was not having any of it. So, chapter 3, I wonder what happens next. I was very curious, I wanted to read it, but then I got involved in this story. So if you've not seen my video of this book, like reviewing this book, you should check it out. So back to Revolutionary Road. Yeah, chapter 3. I have my huge dictionary here, my pen case, and like I said, this dictionary is not what it thought, Webster's, the OG. So we'll be more conscious of our vocabulary this reading. And Brown is again chapter 3. A shrill my the cold has gone, but my voice is still kind of cracking. A shrill metallic whine cut through the silence of his sleep. He tried to hide from it, huddling deeper into a cool darkness where the mist of an absorbing dream still floated. But he came tearing back again and again until his eyes popped open in the sunshine. It was after 11 o'clock, Saturday morning. Both his nostrils were plugged as if with rubber cement. His head ached, and the first fly of the season was crawling up inside of a clouded whiskey glass that stood on the floor beside a nearly empty bottle. Only after making this discovery did he begin to remember the events of the night. How he had sat here drinking until 4 in the morning, methodically scratching his scalp with both hands, convinced that sleep was out of the question. And only after remembering this did his mind come into focus on an explanation of the noise. It was his own rusty lawnmower which needed oiling. Somebody was cutting the grass in the backyard, a thing he had promised to do last weekend. He rolled heavily upright and groped for his bathrobe, moistening the wrinkled roof of his mouth. Then he went and squinted through the brilliant window. It was April herself, stolidly pushing and hauling the old machine, wearing a man's shirt and a pair of loose, flapping slacks, while both children romped behind her with handfuls of cut grass. In the bathroom, he used enough cold water and toothpaste and Kleenex to revive the working parts of his head. He restored its ability to gather oxygen and regained a certain muscular control over its features. But nothing could be done about his hands. Bloated and pale, they felt as if all their bones had been painlessly removed. A command to clench them into fists would have sent him whimpering to his knees. Looking at them, and particularly at the beaten down nails that never in his life had a chance to grow, he wanted to beat and bruise them against the edge of the sink. He thought then of his father's hands, and this reminded him that his dream just now, just before the lawnmower and the headache and the sun, had been of a dim and deeply tranquil time long ago. Both his parents had been there, and he had heard his mother say, "Oh, don't wake him, Earl. Let him sleep." He tried his best to remember more of it, and couldn't, but the tenderness of it brought him close to tears for a moment until it faded away. They had both been dead for several years now, and it sometimes troubled him that he could remember neither of their faces very well. To his waking memory, without the aid of photographs, his father was a vague, bald head with dense eyebrows and a mouth forever fixed in the shape either of disgruntlement or exasperation. his mother a pair of rimless spectacles, a hairnet, and a timorous smear of lipstick. He remembered too of both of them that they had always been tired, middle-aged at the time of his birth and already tired then from having raised two other sons. They had grown steadily and more tired as long as he had known them, until finally tired out they had died with equal ease in their sleep within 6 months of each other. But there had never been anything tired about his father's hands, and no amount of time and forgetfulness had ever dimmed their image in his eyes, in his mind's eye. Open it. That was one of his earliest memories. The challenge to losing one big fist, and his frantic two-handed effort, never succeeding to uncoil a single fat finger from its massively quivering grip, while his father's laughter rang from the kitchen walls. But it wasn't only their strength he envied, it was their sureness and sensitivity. When they held a thing, you could see how it felt, and the aura of mastery they imparted to everything Earl Wheeler used. The creaking pigskin handle of the salesman's briefcase, the hafts of all his woodworking tools, the thrillingly dangerous stock and trigger of his shotgun. The briefcase had been of particular fascination to Frank at the age of 5 or 6. It always stood in the shadows of the front hallway in the evenings, and sometimes after supper he would saunter manfully up to it and pretend it was his own. How fine and smooth, yet how impossibly thick its handle felt. It was heavy, phew, yet how lightly it would swing at his father's side in the morning. Later, at 10 or 12, he had become familiar with the carpentry tools as well, but none of his memories of them were pleasant. "No, boy, no," his father would shout over the scream of the power saw. "You're ruining it. Can't you see you're ruining it? That's no way to handle a tool." The tool, whatever obstinate thing it was, chisel or gouge or brace and bit, would be snatched away from the failure of its dismally sweat-stained woodwork and held aloft to be minutely inspected for damage. Then there will be a lecture on the proper care and handling of tools, to be followed by a gracefully expert demonstration during which the grains of wood clung like gold in the hair of his father's forearm, or more likely by a sigh of manly endurance pressed to the breaking point, and the quiet words, "All right, you better go on upstairs." Things had always ended that way in the woodworking shop, and even today he could never breathe the yellow smell of sawdust without a sense of humiliation. The shotgun, luckily, had never come to a test. By the time he was old enough to go along on one of his father's increasingly rare hunting trips, the chronic discord between them had long precluded any chance of it. It would never have occurred to the old man to suggest such a thing, and what's more, for this was the period of his freight train dreams, it would never have occurred to Frank to desire the suggestion. Who wanted to sit in a puddle and kill a lot of ducks? Who, for that matter, wanted to be good with hobbyist tools? And who wanted to be a dopey salesman in the first place, acting like a big deal with a briefcase full of boring catalogs, talking about machines all day to a bunch of dumb executives with cigars? Yet, even in those days and afterwards, even in the extremities of rebellion on Bethune Street, when his father had become a dreary, querulous old fool, nodding to sleep over the Reader's Digest. Hey, hey, the last book he read was Reader's Digest, volume. Then, as now, he continued to believe that something unique and splendid had lived in his father's hands on Earl Wheeler's very deathbed when he was shrunken and blind and cackling. "Who's that? Frank? Is that Frank?" The dry clasp of his hands had been as positive as ever, and when they lay loose and still on the hospital sheet at last, they still looked stronger and better than his sons. Boy, I guess the head shrinkers could really have a ball with me, he liked to say wryly among friends. I mean, the whole deal of my relationship with my father alone be enough to fill a textbook. Not to mention my mother. Jesus, what a little nest of neuroses we must have been. All the same, in moments of troubled solitude like this, he was glad he could muster some vestige of honest affection for his parents. He was grateful, however uneasy the rest of his life had turned out to be. It had once contained enough peace to give him pleasant dreams, and he often suspected, with more than a little righteousness, that this might be what kept him essentially more stable than his wife. Because if the head shrinkers could have a ball with him, God only knew what kind of a time they would have with April. In all the scanty stories she told about them, her parents were as alien to his sympathetic understanding as anything in the novels of Evelyn Waugh. Had people like that ever really existed, he could he could picture them only as flickering caricatures of the 20s, the playboy and the flapper, mysteriously rich and careless and cruel, married by a ship's captain in mid-Atlantic and divorced within a year of the birth of their only child. I think my mother must have taken me straight from the hospital to Aunt Mary's, she had told him. At any rate, I don't think I ever lived with anyone but Aunt Mary until I was 5. And then there were a couple of other aunts or friends of hers or something before I went to Aunt Claire in Rye. The rest of the story was that her father had shot himself in a Boston hotel room in 1938, and that her mother had died some years later after long incarceration in a West Coast alcoholic retreat. Jesus, Frank said on first hearing these facts, one irritably hot summer night in the Bethune Street place. Though he wasn't quite sure at the time, as he hung and shook his head, whether what he felt was sorrow for the unhappiness of the story or envy because it was so much more dramatic a story than his own. Well, he said, I guess your aunt always really seemed like your mother though, didn't she? But April shrugged, drawing her mouth in a little drawing her mouth a little to one side in a way that he had lately decided he didn't like. Her tough look. Which aunt do you mean? I hardly remember Mary or the others in between, and I always hated Claire. Oh, come on. How can you say you always hated her? I mean, maybe it seems that way now, looking back, but over the years, she must have given you a certain feeling of, love and security and everything. She didn't, though. The only real fun I ever had was when one of my parents came for a visit. They were the ones I loved. But they hardly ever came for visits. I mean, you couldn't have had much sense of their being your parents in a deal like that. You didn't even know them. How could you love them? I did, that's all. As she began picking up and putting away again in her jewelry box the souvenir she had spread before him on the bed. The snapshots of herself at various ages on various lawns, standing with one or the other parent, a miniature painting of her mother's pretty head, a yellow leather framed photograph showing both parents tall and elegantly dressed beside a palm tree with the inscription Cannes 1925, her mother's wedding ring, an ancient brooch containing a lock of her maternal grandmother's hair. Why? A tiny white plastic horse, the size of a watch charm, which had a net value of 2 or 3 cents and had been saved for years because my father gave it to me, in quotes. Oh, all right, sure, he considered. Maybe they did seem romantic and everything. They probably seemed very dazzling and glamorous and all that. The point is, I don't mean that. I mean love. So do I. I did love them. Her grave silence following this statement as she fastened the clasp of the jewelry box was so prolonged that he thought she had finished with the subject. He decided he was finished with it anyway, at least for the time being. It was too hot a night to have an argument. But it turned out that she was only thinking it over, preparing her next words with great care to make sure they would say exactly what she meant. When she began to speak at last, she looked so much like the little girl in the photographs that he was ashamed of himself. I loved their clothes, she said. I loved the way they talked. I loved to hear them tell about their lives. And there was nothing for him to do but take her in his arms, full of pity for the meagerness of her treasure and full of a reverent silent promise, soon to be broken, that he would never again disparage it. A small stain of drying milk and cereal on the table was all that remained of the children's breakfast. The rest of the kitchen gleamed to an industrial perfection of cleanliness. He planned as soon as he had had some coffee to get dressed and go out and take the lawnmower away from her, by force if necessary, in order to restore as much balance to the morning as possible. But he was still in his bathrobe, unshaven and fumbling at the knobs of the electric stove, when Mrs. Given's station wagon came crackling up the driveway. For a second he thought of hiding, but it was too late. She had already seen him through the screen door, and April, trudging along the far border of the backyard, had already escaped her with a wave across the wide expanse of grass and gone on mowing. He was caught. He had to open the door and stand there in an attitude of welcome. Why did this woman keep bothering them all the time? I can't stay a minute, she cried, staggering toward him under the weight of a damp cardboard box full of earth and wobbling vegetation. I just wanted to bring over this sedum for the rocky place at the foot of your drive. My, don't you look comfy? He bent into an ungainly pose, trying to hold the door open with one trailing foot while he took the box from her arms. Well, he said, smiling very close to her tense, powdery face. Mrs. Gibbons' cosmetics seemed always to have been applied in a frenzy of haste, of impatience to get the whole silly business over and done with, and she was constantly in motion, a trim, leather-skinned woman in her 50s whose eyes expressed a religious belief in the importance of keeping busy. Even when she stood still, there was kinetic energy in the set of her shoulders and the hang of her loose, angrily buttoned up clothes. When sitting was inevitable, she always chose straight chairs and used them sparingly. It was hard to imagine her ever lying down, nor was it easy to picture her face asleep, free from the tension of its false smiles, its little bursts of social laughter, and its talk. I really think this is just what's called for down there, don't you? She was saying. Have you worked with this type of sedum before? You find it the most marvelous ground cover, even in this acid soil. Well, he said again, that's fine. Thanks a lot, Mrs. Gibbons. Nearly 2 years ago, she had asked them to call her Helen, a name his tongue seemed all but unable to pronounce. Usually, he solved the problem by calling her nothing, covering the lack with friendly nods and smiles, and she had taken to calling him nothing either. Now, as her small eyes seemed to take in for the first time the fact that his wife was cutting the grass while he lounged around the kitchen in a bathrobe, they stood smiling at each other with uncommon brilliance. He let the screen clap shut behind him and adjusted his grip on the box, which wobbled in his arms and sent a fine stream of sand down his naked ankle. What should we do with it? He asked her. I mean, to make it grow and everything. Well, nothing really. All it wants is just a tiny dollop of water the first few days, and then you find it absolutely thrives. It's rather like the European house leek, you see, that has the except of course that has the lovely pink flower and this has the yellow. Oh, yeah, he said. House leak. She told him a good many other things about the plant while he nodded and watched her and wished she would go away, listening to the whir and whine of the lawnmower. Well, he said when her voice stopped, that's all. Thanks a lot. Can I offer you a cup of coffee? Oh no, thanks ever so much. She skittered 4 or 5 feet away, retreating, as if he had offered her a soiled handkerchief to blow her nose in. Why? What kind of analogy is this? Then, from the safety of her new position, she displayed all her long teeth in an elaborate smile. Do tell April we loved the play last night. Or wait, I'll tell her myself. She craned and squinted into the sun, judging the distance her voice would have to travel, and then she let it loose. April, April, I just wanted to tell you we loved the play. Her strange shouting face could have been the picture of a woman in agony. After a second, the sound of the lawnmower stopped, and April's distant voice said, "What's that?" I say we loved the play. And at last, on hearing April's faint, "Oh, thanks, Helen," she was able to slacken her features. She turned back to Frank, who was still clumsily holding the box. "You really do have a very gifted wife. I can't tell you how much Howard and I enjoyed it." "Good," he said. "Actually, I think the general consensus is that it wasn't too great. I mean, I think most people seem to feel that way." "Oh no, it was charming. I did think your nice friend up the hill was rather unfortunately cast, Mr. Candrell, but otherwise, Campbell, yes. Actually, I don't think he was any worse than some of the others. And of course, he did have a difficult part. He always felt it necessary to defend the Campbells to Mrs. Gibbons, whose view seemed to be that anyone who lived in the Revolutionary Hill estate deserved at best a tactful condescension. I suppose that's true. I was surprised not to see Mrs. Candrell in the group. Or Campbell, is it? Still, I don't expect she'd have the time with all those children. She walked backstage. He was trying to shift the box so that the sand would stop trickling or trickle somewhere else. She was quite active in the whole thing, as a matter of fact. Oh, good. I'm sure she would be. Such a friendly, willing little soul. All right then. She began sidling towards her car. "I won't keep you." This was the moment of her saying, "Oh, one other thing while I think of it." She nearly always did that, and the other thing would turn out to be the thing she had really come for in the first place. Now she hesitated, visibly wondering whether to say it or not. Then her face showed her decision not to, under the circumstances. Whatever it was would have to wait. Fine then. "I simply love the stone path you've started down the front lawn." "Oh," he said. "Thanks. I haven't hardly started it yet." "Oh, I know," she assured him. "It is hard work." Then she trilled a gracious little two-note song of goodbye and twitched into her station wagon, which rolled slowly away. "Mommy, look what Daddy's got," Jennifer was calling. "Mrs. Gibbons brought it." And Michael, the 4-year-old, said, "It's flowers." "Is it flowers or what?" They were hurrying towards him over the cropped grass, while April slowly and heavily brought up the rear, pulling the lawnmower behind her, blowing down strands of hair away from her eyes with a stuck-out lower lip. Everything about her seemed determined to prove, with a new flat-footed emphasis, that a sensible middle-class housewife was all she had ever wanted to be, and that all she had ever wanted of love was a husband who would get out and cut the grass once in a while instead of sleeping all day. "It's leaking, Daddy," Jennifer said. "I know it's leaking. Quiet a minute. Listen," he said to his wife without quite looking at her. "Would you mind telling me what I'm supposed to do with this stuff?" "How should I know? What is it?" "I don't know what the hell it is. It's European house leak or something." European what? Oh no, wait a second. It's like house leek, only it's pink instead of yellow. Yellow instead of pink. I thought you probably know all about it. Whatever made you think that? She came up close to squint at the plant, fingering one of their fleshy stems. What's it for? Didn't she say? His mind was a blank. Wait a second, it's called beecham. Or wait, sicham. I'm pretty sure it's sicham. He licked his lips and changed his grip on the box. It's marvelous in acid soil. Does that ring a bell? The children were switching their hopeful eyes from one parent to the other, and Jennifer was beginning to look worried. April ran her fingers into her hip pockets. Marvelous for what? You mean you didn't even ask her? The plants were quivering in his arms. Look, could you kind of take it easy? I haven't had any coffee yet, and I. Oh, this is well. What am I supposed to do with this stuff? What am I supposed to tell the woman the next time I see her? Tell her any goddamn thing you like, he said. Maybe you could tell her to mind her own goddamn business for a change. Don't shout, Daddy. Jennifer was bouncing up and down in her grass-stained sneakers, flapping her hands and starting to cry. I'm not shouting, he told her with all the indignation of the falsely accused. She held still then and put her thumb in her mouth, which seemed to make her eyes go out of focus, while Michael clutched at the fly of his pants and took two backward steps, solemn with embarrassment. April sighed and raked back a lock of hair. All right, she said. Take it down to the cellar then. The least we can do is get it out of sight. Then you better get dressed. It's time for lunch. He carried the box down the cellar stairs, dropping it on the floor with a rustling thud, and kicked it into a corner, sending a sharp pain through the tendon of his big toe. Good for him. Good for him. He spent the afternoon in an old pair of army pants and a torn shirt, walking on the stone path. The idea was to lay a long curving walk from the front door to the road to divert visitors from coming in through the kitchen. It had seemed simple enough last weekend when he had started it, but now as the ground sloped off more sharply that he found that flat stones wouldn't work. He had to make steps of stones nearly as thick as they were wide, stones that had to be dislodged from the steep woods behind the house and carried on tottering legs around to the front lawn. And he had to dig a pit for each step in ground so rocky that it took 10 minutes to get a foot below the surface. It was turning into mindless, unrewarding work, the kind of work that makes you clumsy with fatigue and petulant with lack of progress, and it looked as if it would take all summer. Even so, once the first puffing and dizziness was over, he began to like the muscular pull and the sweat of it, and the smell of the earth. At least it was a man's work. At least squatting to rest on the wooded slope, he could look down and see his house the way a house ought to look on a fine spring day, safe on its carpet of green, the frail white sanctuary of a man's love, a man's wife and children. Lowering his eyes with the solemnity of this thought, he could take pleasure in the sight of his own flexed thigh, lean and straining under the old OD, and of the heavily veined and of the heavily veined forearm that lay across it, and the dirty hand that hung there. Not to be compared with his father's hand maybe, but a serviceable, good enough hand all the same, so that his temples ached in zeal and triumph as he helped a rock up frog. So that his temples ached in zeal and triumph as he helped the rock up from the stalk of its white warmed socket and let it roll end over end down the shuddering leaf mold, because he was a man. Following it down to the edge of the lawn, he spotted over it again grunted, wrestled it up to his thighs and from there to his waist, cradling it in the tender flesh of his forearms. Then he moved out, glassy-eyed and staggering on the soft grass, out around the white block of the house and into the sun of the front lawn, and all the way over to the path where he dropped it and nearly fell in a heap on top of it. "We're helping you, aren't we, Daddy?" Jennifer said. Both children had come to sit near him on the grass. The sun made perfect circles of yellow on their two blond heads and gave their t-shirts a dazzling whiteness. "You sure are," he said. "Yes, because you like to have us keep you company, don't you?" "I sure do, baby. Don't get too close now. You kick dirt in the hole." And he fell to work with the long-handled shovel to deepen the hollow he had dug, enjoying the rhythmic rasp and grip of the blade against a loosening edge of buried rock. "Daddy," Michael inquired, "why does the shovel make sparks?" "Because it's hitting rock. When you hit rock with steel, you get a spark." "Why don't you take the rock out?" "That's what I'm trying to do." "Don't get so close now, you might get hurt." The piece of rock came free at last. He lifted it out and knelt to claw at the sliding tan pebbles of the pit until the depth and the shape of it looked right. Then he heaved and rolled the boulder into place and packed it tight, and another step was completed. A light swarm of gnats had come to hover around his head, tickling and barely visible as they hung and flicked past his eyes. "Daddy," Jennifer said, "how come mommy slept on the sofa?" "I don't know. Just happened to feel like it, I guess. You wait here now while I go and get another stone." And the more he thought about it as he plodded back up through the trees and behind the house, the more he realized that this was the best answer he could have given from the standpoint of simple honesty as well as tact. She just happened to feel like it. Wasn't that, after all, the only reason there was? Had she ever had a less selfish, more complicated reason for doing anything in her life? "I love you when you're nice," she had told him once, before they were married, and it had made him furious. "Don't say that. Christ's sake, you don't love people when they are nice. Don't you see that's the same as saying, 'what's in it for me?'" Look, they were stand look, they were standing on 6th Avenue in the middle of the night, and he was holding her at arm's length, his hands placed firmly on either side of the warm rib cage inside her polo coat. "Look, you either love me or you don't, and you're going to have to make up your mind." Oh, she had made up her mind all right. It had been easy to decide in favor of love on Bethel Street, in favor of walking proud and naked on the grass rug of an apartment that caught the morning sun around its makeshift chairs, its French travel posters, and its bookcase made of packing crate slats. An apartment where half the fun of having an affair was that it was just like being married, and where later, after a trip to City Hall and back, after a ceremonial collecting of the other two keys from the other two men, half the fun of being married was that it was just like having an affair. She had decided in favor of that. She had decided in favor of that. All right. She had decided in favor of that, all right. And why not? Wasn't it the first love of any kind she had ever known? Even on the level of practical advantage, it must have held an undeniable appeal. It freed her from the gritty round of disappointment she would otherwise have faced as an only mildly talented, mildly enthusiastic graduate of dramatic school. It let her languish attractively through a part-time office job, just until my husband finds the kind of work he really wants to do, while saving her best energies for animated discussions of books and pictures and the shortcomings of other people's personalities, for trying new ways of fixing her hair and new kinds of inexpensive clothes. Do you really like the sandals, or are they too villagey? And for hours of unhurried dalliance deep in their double bed. But even in those days, she had held herself poised for immediate flight. She had always been ready to take off the minute she happened to feel like it. Don't talk to me that way, Frank, or I'm leaving. I mean it. Or the minute anything went wrong. And one big thing went wrong right away. According to their plan, which called for an eventual family of four, her first pregnancy came 7 years too soon. That was the trouble. And if he had known her better then, he might have guessed how she would take it and what she would happen to feel like doing about it. At the time though, coming home from the doctor's office in a steamy crosstown bus, he was wholly in the dark. She refused to look at him as they rode. She carried her head high in a state of shock or disbelief or anger or blame. It could have been any or all or none of these things for all he knew. Pressed close and sweating beside her with his jaw set, normally in a brief smile, trying to think of things to say. He knew only that everything was out of kilter. Whatever you felt on hearing the news of conception, even if it was chagrin instead of joy, wasn't it supposed to be something the two of you shared? Your wife wasn't supposed to turn away from you, was she? You weren't supposed to have to work and wheedle to win her back with little jokes and hand holdings as if you were afraid she might evaporate at the very moment of this first authentic involvement in your lives. That couldn't be right. Then what the hell was the matter? It wasn't until a week later that he came home to find her stalking the apartment with folded arms, her eyes remote and her face fixed in the special look that meant she had made up her mind about something and would stand for no nonsense. Frank, listen. Try not to start talking until I finish, and just listen. And in an oddly stifled voice, as if she had rehearsed her speech several times without allowing for the fact that she would have to breathe while delivering it. She had told him of a girl in dramatic school who knew from first-hand experience an absolutely infallible way to induce a miscarriage. It was simplicity itself. You waited until just the right time, the end of the third month. Then you took a sterilized rubber syringe and a little bit of sterilized water, and you very carefully dot dot dot. Even as he filled his lungs for shouting, he knew it wasn't the idea itself that repelled him. The idea itself, God knew, was more than a little attractive. It was that she had done all this on her own, in secret, had sought out the girl, and had obtained the facts, and bought the rubber syringe, and rehearsed the speech. That if she had thought about him at all, it was only as a possible hitch in the scheme, a source of tiresome objections that would have to be cleared up and disposed of if the thing were to be carried out with maximum efficiency. That was the intolerable part of it. That was what enriched his voice with a tremor of outrage. Christ's sake, don't be an idiot. You want to kill yourself? I don't even want to hear about it. She sighed patiently. All right, Frank, in that case, there's certainly no need for you to hear about it. I only told you because I thought you might be willing to help me in this thing. Obviously, I should have known better. Listen, listen to me. You do this, and I swear to God, I'll. Oh, you what? You leave me? Was that supposed to be a threat or a promise? And the fight went on all night. He caused them to hiss and grapple and knock over a chair. It spilled outside and downstairs and into the street. Get away from me! Get away from me! It watched them trembling up against the high wire fence of a waterfront junkyard until a waterfront drunk came to stare at them and make them waver home. And he could feel the panic and the shame of it even now, leaning here against the tree with this gnat tickling his neck. All that saved him, all that saved him, all that enabled him now to crouch and lift a new stone from its socket and follow its rumbling fall with the steady and dignified tread of self-respect was that the next day he had won. The next day, weeping in his arms, she had allowed herself to be dissuaded. Oh, I know, she had whispered against his shirt. I know you're right. I'm sorry, I love you. We'll name it Frank and we'll send it to college and everything. I promise, promise. And it seemed to him now that no single moment of his life had ever contained a better proof of manhood than that. If any proof were needed, holding that tame, submissive girl and saying, oh my lovely, while she promised, she would bear his child. Lurching and swaying under the weight of the stone in the sun, dropping it at last and wiping his sore hands, he picked up the shovel and went to work again, while the children's voices fluted and chirped around him, as insidiously torturing as the gnat. And I didn't even want a baby, he thought to the rhythm of his digging. Is it that the darnest thing? I didn't want a baby any more than she did. Wasn't it true then that everything in his life from that point on had been a succession of things he hadn't really wanted to do? Taking a hopelessly dull job to prove he could be as responsible as any other family man. Moving to an overpriced genteel apartment to prove his mature belief in the fundamentals of orderliness and good health. Having another child to prove that the first one hadn't been a mistake. Buying a house in the country because that was the next logical step. And he had to prove himself capable of taking it. Proving and proving. And for no other reason than that he was married to a woman who had somehow managed to put him forever on the defensive, who loved him when he was nice, who lived according to what she happened to feel like doing, and who might at any time, this was the hell of it, who might at any time of day or night just happen to feel like leaving him. It was as ludicrous and as simple as that. Are you hitting rock again, Daddy? Not this time, he said. This is a root. I think it's too deep to matter though. If you just get out of the way now, I'll try and fit the stone in. Kneeling, he rolled the boulder into place, but it wouldn't settle. It wobbled and it sat 3 inches too high. That's too high, Daddy. I know it, baby. He laboriously pried the stone out again and began hacking at the root, trying to cut it, using the shovel like a clumsy axe. It was as tough as cartilage. Sweetie, I said don't come so close. You're kicking dirt in the hole. I'm helping, Daddy. Jennifer looked hot and surprised, and he thought she might be going to cry again. He tried to make his voice very low and gentle. Look, everybody, why don't you find something else to do? You've got the whole yard to play in. Come on now. That's the idea. I'll call you if I need any help. But in a minute they were back, sitting too close and talking quietly together. Dizzy with effort and blind with sweat, he was straddling the pit and holding the shovel vertically, like a pile driver, lifting it high and bringing it down with all his strength on the root. He had torn a ragged wound in it, laying open its moist white meat. But it wouldn't break, it wouldn't give, and it made the children laugh each time the shovel bounced and rang in his hand. The delicate noise of their laughter, the look of their tulip soft skin, and of their two sunny skulls, as fragile as eggshell, made a terrible contrast to the feel of biting steel and shuddering pulp, and it was his sense of this that made his eyes commit a distortion of truth. For a split second, in the act of bringing the shovel down, he thought he saw Michael's white sneaker slip into its path. Even as he swerved and threw the shovel away with a clang, he knew it hadn't really happened. But it could have happened. That was the point. And its anger was so quick that the next thing he knew, he had grabbed him by the belt, spun him around, and hit him hard on the buttocks with the flat of his hand. Twice, surprised at the stunning vigor of the blows and at the roar of his own voice. Get out of here now! Get out of here! Leaping and twisting, clutching the seat of his pants with both hands, Michael found his need to cry so sudden and so deep that for several seconds after the first shocked squeal, no sound could break from him. His eyes winkled shut, his mouth opened and was locked in that position while his lungs fought for breath. Then out it came, a long high wail of pain and humiliation. Jennifer watched him round-eyed, and in the next breath, her own face began to twitch and crumple, and she was crying too. I kept telling you, he explained to them, waving his arms. I told you there would be trouble if you got too close. Didn't I? Didn't I? All right, now take off, both of you. They didn't need to be told. They were moving steadily away from him, across the grass, crying, looking back at him with infinite reproachfulness. In another second, he might have been running after them with apologies. He might have been crying too if he hadn't forced himself to pick up the shovel and bang it at the root again. As he worked, he prepared an anxious, silent brief in his own defense. Well, damn it, I did keep telling them and telling them, he assured himself. And by now, his mind had mercifully amended the fact. The kid put his foot right the hell in my way, for God's sake. If I hadn't swerved just in time, he wouldn't have a foot, for God's sake. When he looked up again, he saw that April had come out of the kitchen door and around the side of the house, and he saw that the children had run to her and hidden their faces in her trousers. Oh, God. Oh my God. Okay, so by now, like, I've come to the acceptance that reading this book is going to be right, because Frank's head is just so busy. Frank has like a million thoughts going through his head, and it's just and like they're just focused on like ruminations of what could have been, what went wrong, how he can make himself look good. And by good, I mean make himself be a man, you know like in this chapter alone, I saw like almost 3 4 times where Frank kept talking about being a man, his manness, his manhood, his image, his man. It was a man's work, all of that. How his father's hands were more like better than his hand, like how his father's hand was more like implied more masculinity, or yes, masculinity than his, and how his hand will never be up to his father's hand, but at least his hands are still somewhat presentable. And then there are moments where it happened in the first chapter or the second one, when he went backstage and he was supposed to be comforting April, but then he was looking at himself in the mirror, trying to present himself in a way if I hold myself this way, would I look more like the man that I think I am? That kind of energy. And now again, as he was in this chapter 3, he was rolling the stones to make the steps, in the front lawn and all of that. And he kept thinking, oh, like he saw the way his thighs flexed, the way his arms was leaning across the thighs. He felt like, oh yeah, he was admiring himself, kind of like, oh yes, I have the body of a man in that sense. And then when he was like doing thankless, difficult job, he was thinking, yes, this is at least is a man's work. So Frank, as I'm beginning to see, Frank is caught up in the idea of manhood and masculinity, all of it, which is toxic, not healthy at all. But like, that is the list of the issues here, whether it's toxic or not. Um, personally, like Frank's life is, I don't know, it's just the moment where he decides to come downstairs to take over from April mowing the lawn, and he just gives up on it. And then the estate agent lady, she came to give him like a gift or something of flowers, and he's the one that had the conversation with her, which he zoned out from. Then he was now like screaming at his wife to know something that was given to him when she was not even there in the scene at all. And then again, having the children play with him, trying to connect with him. He keeps talking about how, oh, his head shrinker, because it was the nine, it was the 30s, I think, or the 40s. I'm not really good with timelines or something, but it was that period. So I think they used to call therapists head shrinkers. So he keeps thinking to himself, oh, head shrinkers will have a few days with me because of the issues I had with my dad growing up and my mother, blah blah blah. But he's perpetrating the same issues that head shrinkers would have a field day with his own children. And he's not even apologetic at all about it. To him, he's the most important person in his life, his forefront in his life. He wants to know, all the things that I can be, all the potential I can be, oh, I could be this, I could be that. And it's so insane that when April was having the issue of being like pregnant, not wanting the pregnancy, he made a whole big fuss out of it. And he didn't clearly communicate that she should have involved him in it. I don't know if he did, because the way April responded, she felt maybe he didn't want her to get rid of the child. And because of this misunderstanding, this miss in communication, yes, this miscommunication, he just kept running along with it. He said proving and proving. So like I said, instead of vocabulary in this book, I think I'll be focusing more on phrases that I enjoy, and there's this part where Frank is working on the, like, if you heard me reading Frank, this moment where he gets an intrusive thought of really hurting his children with the shovel. It's just so insane. Like, that's what you call an intrusive thought, actually. Basically, that's how severe, or unhinged intrusive thoughts actually are. And since he doesn't have any way of personally regulating his own emotions, which he's responsible for, he takes it out on other people. You have an intrusive thought and you are scared by the horrific nature of this thought, horrific basis of this thought, and instead of you focusing on yourself, and looking inwards and being like, oh, this is messed up here, I can't, like, this thought is messed up, where did it come from? He takes his anger out on his children. Yet they weren't even in the way, but he convinces himself that, yeah, they were in the way, that's why he hurt, that's why he spanked them so badly and embarrassed them, and shamed them and scared them off, when they were just trying to connect with him. Anyway, so from the point of the proving with April, like when Frank is in his head tracing back where everything like went wrong in that sense, in his own life. He doesn't even care about the marriage, in his own life, like trying to prove this, prove that, making decisions and blaming other people for the decisions that you made, for your own gratification. Because every time he made these decisions that he didn't want to make, they were for him to prove something to himself, for him to satisfy the desire to be a man, the proof of manhood. He wanted to give himself proofs of manhood. So if you're giving yourself, making decisions to certify your own manhood, your masculinity, why should another person be blamed for it? Do you get? Because then, as it's hitting the rock, the writer makes this juxtaposition of him hitting, instead of the rock now, he's not hitting a rock in the soil, he's hitting a root. And the root has gone way too deep, to be removed. It requires, at this point, what he's doing physically, like actually what he's doing with his hand, requires a professional coming in and just digging the whole thing up. But instead of thinking in that level, he keeps trying, like, as if he can take out the root with a blunt, ineffective weapon, which is the shovel. And in this case, this thing he does in his head, thinking, okay, you can solve questions, you can solve things by putting band-aids or sorry, and I will do better, I will do this, I will do. But resolutions that only stay in your mind, they can't come into the physical, into your existence, because you don't know how to translate, your motivations into actions. You don't know how to translate it, because you have never, like, you are just emotionally stunted that way. And that's the same way the shovel is stunted. And the shovel is not enough, because the more he keeps trying to use the shovel to remove the root, his hands are feeling the reverberations of it. When you use a shovel to hit something hard, it's going to send the shock waves through your hands. So that's what he's feeling, and he's frustrated with it that there's no progress. And there's the thought of, he might have to, the conclusion that is probably thinking of, that he will have to give up on this part, like at this point in the project. But it's not giving up, you just have to call a professional to get rid of the tree stump or the roots that is stuck there blocking your progress. But like he said, head shrinkers would have a day with me. Like, he doesn't want to call head shrinkers for himself, he doesn't want to ask for professional help, and so he's just taking out his anger on everybody around him. So this is not a review, it's just a read along, but it's fun. I like this read, I like this writing. I have fun, like I had fun reading it. I like the pacing of it, and I enjoyed how everything that Frank does, he's, you think with all the rumination in his brain, he's self-aware. He's not self-aware, he just has a bunch of thoughts and he does nothing with it. So thank you for being here, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.